Welcome to Animology, a podcast about language, the animal-related words and expressions we use every day, and how these words shape and reflect our relationship with animals. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at ColleenPatrickGoudreau.com and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, be sure to subscribe to Animology at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you are enjoying this free podcast, please share it with others and leave ratings and reviews. Word of mouth is a fantastic way to increase its listenership, and supporting it is the best way to keep it going. So you can go to animologypodcast.com and click on the donate button, or you can go to patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau and leave a tip in the jar. Today's episode is Vegetarians Eat Meat, the history and future of the word. You've heard me talk about how, following the Norman invasion and conquest of 1066, when William of Normandy was crowned King of England, over 10,000 French words were adopted into the English language over the course of a couple hundred years, many of which were related to food and to the animals we eat. Prior to the influx of words from Old French and Norman French, Old English had a single word for the living animals and another word for the slaughtered. The Old English words, often with Proto-Indo-European roots, reflecting some attribute of the living animal, and you can find more about this in the episode called Animal Characteristics in Word Histories, who they are in what we say. And with the influence of French, we changed the way we refer to and name many animals. English now has one word for the living animal and one word for the slaughtered. Living boar and swine became pork. Living cow became beef. Living sheep became mutton, and so on. The related episode, Old English pigs and Old French pork, illustrates the lexical shift that took place, provides the derivation of the Old English words for domesticated animals, and argues that by separating out the living animal from the dead, we practice a kind of cognitive dissonance necessary to consume so many animals so often with neither thought nor compunction. In other words, when we take the life out of the animals linguistically, we're more capable of taking the life out of the animals literally. In this episode, we're going to delve deep into the word meat itself and the fact that the Anglo-Saxons did make a distinction in their language when referring to the animals they reared and the animals they ate. When I talk about the Anglo-Saxons and the Anglo-Saxon language, I'm talking about the Germanic tribes who migrated to Britain from continental Europe starting in the 5th century. Simplistically speaking, the Anglo-Saxon period can be said to have begun in the early 400s and end when the Normans invade in 1066. So early 400s to 1066. The language itself is referred to interchangeably as Anglo-Saxon and Old English. One of the things that's so fascinating about this language to me is that although about 85% of the Old English words are no longer in use in modern English, the majority of our most common English words are from Old English. In other words, quantitatively, the majority of modern English words derive from French, Latin, and Greek, not Old English. But the majority of our most commonly used words in modern English are Old English. But the majority of our most commonly used words in modern English are Old English, based on the evidence of the Oxford English Corpus, which currently contains over 2 billion words. The majority of the top 25 nouns, so 15 of them, are from Old English. Of the 25 most frequently used verbs, 20 are Old English words. And of the 25 most used adjectives, 17 derive from Old English. Adjectives like good, new, first, last, long, great, little, old, big, small, and large. Verbs like be, have, do, say, come, get, go, make, and know. Function words of, for, and, under, and on. Nouns like house, mother, father, day, life, work, land, winter, child, and every animal on the farm from yesteryear right up through to today. As you heard in the episode Old English Pigs and Old French Pork, the words cow, steer, bull, ox, calf, pig, hog, swine, boar, sow, sheep, ram, ewe, wether, chicken, duck, goose, and fowl, even those animals killed and consumed but not necessarily domesticated, deer, stag, buck, and doe, are all Old English words, which indicates how far back these relationships go and how significant their presence was in our human histories, for better or for worse, mostly worse for them. Well, another Old English noun is meat, which is inherited from an old Germanic word and which dates at least as far back as 731, when the Venerable Bede completed the ecclesiastical history of the English people. It is in Bede's great work that we have the first written documentation of the word meat, which in Old English would have been pronounced and was typically spelled meta, M-E-T-E. At that time, the meaning of the word meta, meat, was not the narrow meaning we have today. It referred more broadly to food in general. It referred to a solid substance to be consumed rather than a liquid substance to be drunk. In other words, a vegetarian at the time could say she ate meat, meta, and no one would think twice about it. Meta referred to food in general, and this was the case for several centuries. The sense of meat as animal flesh used as food is first attested in around 1300. But even in the 16th and 17th centuries, the word meat, even though it could also pertain to animal flesh for consumption, meant food in general, which makes for some interesting interpretations of passages from texts such as the King James Version of the Bible, completed in 1611. So you have a quote from Genesis, "And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat," and it was so. Of course, in the idyllic Garden of Eden prior to the fall, Adam and Eve had never eaten the flesh of animals, so this passage doesn't make sense unless the reader understands that the meaning of the word meat in the 17th century was food. Moreover, vegetables, as reflected in the passage above, would have been called herbs and sometimes grenemeta, or green meat. So a contemporary translation might read, "I have given every green plant for food." Another semantic fossil that leaves a clue about the origins of the word meat as food in general is in sweetmeat, sweetemeta, a 16th century word that means a sweet delicacy or confectionery, such as candy, sugared cakes or pastries, or even crystallized fruits. So sweetmeat still refers to that today. Sweet bread, on the other hand, is a completely different story, referring to the innards of an animal, usually a calf or a lamb, served as food. So make sure you know the difference between the two before ordering blindly in a British restaurant. So this brings us back to the Anglo-Saxons. Once the Normans invaded and began infiltrating English through the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, we begin to see a lexical split as new words for the animal slaughtered for consumption came into English from French. Now you weren't eating bulls, but beef. Not hogs, but pork. Not sheep, but mutton. Old English words for the living animals, French-inspired Middle English words for the slaughtered, which are still the words we use today. I argue in Old English Pigs and Old French Pork episode that this lexical distinction contributes to our cognitive dissonance today. So much so that people are offended if a vegetarian calls a hamburger a cow burger, a pork chop the spine of a pig, or veal a baby calf. But what of the Anglo-Saxons? Before the Norman conquest, the Anglo-Saxons used the same single word for the animals they raised and the animals they killed. Why did they feel no need to make a distinction? Well, if we dig a little deeper, we find that the Anglo-Saxons did make a distinction in their language when referring to the animals they reared and the animals they ate. The Anglo-Saxons would have used compounds familiar to their Germanic roots and prevalent in Old English, such as lamb flesh. They would have said Lambesfleisch, Schäpefleisch, sheep flesh, Kalfsfleisch, calf flesh, Hennefleisch, hen flesh, Gossefleisch, goose flesh, and Swinefleisch, pig flesh, to distinguish the living animal from the eaten animal. In fact, the term cow meat endured in the Yorkshire dialect in England well into the 1950s, unchanged by almost 1,000 years of Anglo-Norman lexical influence. Cow meat clarifies that the meat is not food in general, but flesh from a cow. And all the other compounds clarify that it's not the living animal being referred to, cow, swine, hen, lamb, sheep, but their dead, dismembered flesh, cow flesh, swine flesh, hen flesh, lamb flesh, sheep flesh, and so on. This construction is still evident in the modern German language, which uses the name for the living animal plus the word flesh to refer to different types of animal-based meat. Hence Rind, German for cow or bovine, plus Fleisch, German for flesh. So Rindfleisch means beef. The word Schwein, pig, plus Fleisch, flesh, is Schweinfleisch, which means pork. The word Kalb, calf, plus Fleisch is Kalbfleisch, which means veal. Some German dialects use Hähnchenfleisch to refer to chicken as meat built from Hähnchen, hen or chicken, plus Fleisch. In Old English, Fleisch or Fleischmette, flesh meat, would have been a common term to refer to the flesh of animals used for consumption, as seen in Ælfric's colloquy from around the year 1000 and in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 1154. The word meat wouldn't have been sufficient to denote the flesh of an animal because, as I said, the word meat referred to food in general. This is, in fact, a similar evolution in French of the word viande, meaning meat, which also originally meant food in general, not simply the flesh of animals for consumption. Hence, it would have been common in Old French to refer to viande de mouton, the meat of a sheep, or viande de bœuf, the meat of a cow, viande de veau, meat of a calf, to distinguish between the living and the butchered animals, and forgive my butchered French. In fact, the word viande derives from the Latin word vivere, which means to live. Food, of course, sustains life, and it makes sense that a word depicting life would not have referred to the flesh of dead animals. However, over time, the word viande, like the English word meat, was later narrowed to indeed mean the flesh of animals. And yet, there is a remnant of that use of the word meat that we still use today, not only in sweetmeat that I mentioned earlier, but also when we say the meat of a nut or coconut meat to denote the edible portion inside the shell of these plant foods. The word meat is also often used in a metaphorical sense to mean general sustenance, as in the phrase meat and drink. And the use of the word meat to refer to the substantial part of a story or to a matter of importance is common today. So when we say get to the meat of the story or getting to the meat of the matter, we're harking back to the early meaning of the word meat as substance, not as the flesh of animals. At a time when vegetarian and vegan food items are dominating supermarket shelves and restaurant menus, there's a tendency, even among vegetarians and vegans, to refer to these products as fake meats or faux meats, implying that the matter that comprises the veggie burger or the veggie dog is unreal or illegitimate or unappetizing, which I argue negatively influences the way the general public perceives these foods. Personally, I avoid the use of such terms as fake, faux, alternative, imitation, mock, replacement, analog, or substitute when referring to plant-derived or cultured meats and milks, as those terms in this context undermine the legitimacy of the flavor, the texture, and the nutrient profile of the underlying substance, whether that substance be grains, beans, lentils, or nuts. Far from fake, these foods reside in the major plant kingdoms from which we derive much of our pleasure and most of our nutrition. So in the way we already honor the 1,000-year-old meaning of the word meat in such terms as coconut meat and nut meat, I use grain meat or wheat meat, even vegan meat or plant-based meat to refer to animal-free deli slices, roasts, and nuggets. And just as the language of our Old English ancestors and our modern German contemporaries distinguish between the living animal, cow, and the flesh of that animal, cow flesh, or Rind and Rindfleisch, so too do I use the terms animal-based meat and plant-based meat to accurately differentiate one from the other. Words do matter. It's worth repeating. Language is not simply a means of communication. It represents and reinforces the attitudes of our culture. It informs and gives social credit to our thoughts and actions. And it masks, justifies, or dulls our ethical red flags. By making conscious choices about how we talk about animals and the flesh and fluids we take from them, we may find that we are more inclined to make more conscious choices in terms of our regard for them, laws related to them, in terms of our relationship with them, and our treatment of them. If you appreciate what you hear in this podcast, you can show your appreciation by filling up the tip jar. Not only does your support make everything that goes into this podcast possible, the research, the writing, the preparation, the recording, the editing, the file hosting, the social media marketing, you also enjoy some perks such as written transcripts to each and every episode. Show your appreciation by adding a tip to the jar at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau or at animologypodcast.com and click on the donate button for the animals. This is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you for listening to Animology, changing the way we talk and think about other animals.